I need a better backdrop. Welcome back to my channel, and happy Pride. I feel like people don't say it enough, so I make sure I say it all the time here. Happy Pride. I should have probably done this as my first Pride video for this month, but I didn't think of it until like yesterday. So we're gonna do it now. So this video is gonna kind of be for everyone, for people newly discovering themselves or their gay identities, allies who want to stay informed, or maybe veteran queer folk who just want to stay up to date with modern terminology. Even if none of those apply to you, you're still welcome. Since we're going to be talking about a lot of different identities today, I want to point out the fact that the creation of new micro labels or the shifting of definitions when it comes to gender identities or sexualities, it's not any sort of indication that we're going like off the deep end, like I think a lot of people try and phrase it. It just means that people are more comfortable and open with recognizing themselves and acknowledging all of the ways in which we are similar and or different. And I think that that's actually really great. I think that that's something that we should be celebrating together, and that's kind of what Pride is all about. There's also the very common analogy to left-handedness that a lot of people like to bring up, is when being left-handed became, decriminalized or just normalized in society, it wasn't necessarily that more people were being born left-handed. It was just that people became more comfortable being openly left-handed in society. And that's kind of exactly the same thing for Pride and for gay identities, is that it's not like how a lot of people like to claim that, oh, because of social media and because people are saying that they're gay a lot more often, it's creating all of these people that think that they're gay. Like it's not like that. It's just as we create a society where people feel more comfortable being themselves, then you'll see a lot more people taking the time to understand themselves better and really recognize how they feel attraction and how that might differ from whatever narrative they were told as children. If anything, I feel like the over-policing of people's sexualities is much more harmful. So there's a few videos like this on YouTube, but I wanted to make one that felt a little bit more personal. I'm going to give a brief overview of what Pride is as a movement and how it started, and we'll also go over a lot of the labels that people in the community claim. We'll do the letters in the acronym that everybody knows, being LGBTQ, and then we'll do some more on top of that I find pretty commonly online, and then we'll do some slightly more niche ones. And it's not niche as in like people that experience that kind of attraction are rare, but more so that they're just less commonly talked about. I'm really hoping that this video can help people maybe find themselves a little bit, identify something that they couldn't name before, or just find any sense of community. And as with any of my videos, if I'm wrong about anything, if anything comes out wrong or you want to correct me, that's completely fine. I read every comment and I'm always willing to discuss in the comments. So first we're going to start with the Stonewall riots, say that very loosely, which is largely known as the sort of inciting incident for the Pride movement as we know it today. In 1969, NYPD raided the Stonewall Inn, a mostly gay bar in Greenwich Village, to arrest anyone found cross-dressing, which was illegal at the time. There were a lot of really disturbing comments that I found about wanting to examine people in the bathroom to make sure that they weren't cross-dressing, and that was very sad to read. This resistance against the invasion led to widespread uprisings as queer and trans communities pushed back. Trans women of color were some of the most prominent leaders in this pushback, which I'm so proud of. This resistance came as sort of a culmination of the frustrations and the fears that had plagued these communities for literal decades, even centuries if you go all the way back, and it was against the unjust policing that targeted them specifically. People gathered to commemorate the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising and marched in New York's first official Pride Parade. I read that the parade actually took like half the allotted amount of time because people were just like so excited. Of course, some people were nervous about making such like a bold declaration of resistance and unity. A lot of people were nervous about, violence or animosity from onlookers, but from what I found, it was very successful. And before we get into like the meat of the video, I really just wanted to take a moment and thank everybody who has allowed us to get where we are today, where people can proudly be themselves in a lot of open spaces like we never could have imagined 100 years ago. Because it's crazy how recent all of this is. It feels like stuff that happened a billion years ago, and they do sort of the same thing like they do with the civil rights movement, where they try and put a lot of those pictures in black and white It was in the 70s. It was not that long ago. And I'm just so grateful for all of the queer people and trans people and allies who have fought to get us where we are today. So here's to you. Anybody who's a part of a marginalized community knows that the fight is never truly over. People try and argue that, oh, well, you have rights now. You can get married now. Why are you still fighting? Because rights are currently getting repealed and they will continue to try and repeal them. So the fight's never over. So now I want to do a little bit of an overview of a bunch of different pride identities, some common, some less common, all completely valid. Most identities revolve around the concept of gender, which is really funny to me because gender doesn't really exist in the way that traditional society wants us to believe. I've done a lot of searching and a lot of soul searching recently about what gender is and what it means to me. And it's such a complex, line of thought. I see a lot of people try to devalue gender studies as a discipline, and it's so fascinating. I highly recommend looking into it. But I think the gender state as a fluctuating, highly personal concept is kind of what ties us all together. It makes every single person's experience so completely unique and also very difficult to define because it kind of changes from person to person. I'm going to do my best. I tried to find the most comprehensive definitions, and I'm going to do my best to describe them to the best of my knowledge. Also, something that I 100% should have mentioned in my last video and that some people pointed out in the comments, which I'm very grateful for, is the split attraction theory. So that basically argues that romantic attraction and attraction in bed can be considered separate for so many people. And a lot of the time they don't match up. Someone might only be attracted to women romantically and men in bed, and that's fine. And all of the identities that I'm going to detail here, they can be applied either sexually or romantically. And people can exhibit any combination of these. So you could be maybe bisexual and panromantic. And the fact that people can have literally any combination of these makes the space not only so diverse and so much fun, but it also makes it so satisfying to find a label or a way to describe yourself to a T, because you're not restricted to one specific label or anything like that. There's so many to choose from. You can mix and match. You can find anything that works for you. And if you don't like to use labels at all, that's completely fine too. There's absolutely nothing wrong wanting to keep yourself open, not wanting to pin yourself down to social constraints or anything like that. I know for a very long time I identified as unlabeled because it was so frustrating every single time that I started to feel attraction towards somebody that didn't fit the box of what I thought I was supposed to according to how I identified. I would have an existential crisis because I think that I would have to reevaluate my whole personhood, but it's not that deep. It honestly does not matter. Just be who you are. Your love is never going to go wrong as long as they're of age. So first we have just LGBTQ as a blanket term. It pretty much just refers to anybody in the community, anybody who you might find at Pride. And this is pretty much where you see the main rainbow flag, which I think is beautiful. Then for the letters in the acronym, we have L, which stands for lesbian. This refers to non-men who love exclusively non-men. I don't say women loving exclusively women because you can identify as non-binary and a lesbian. I know a ton of people like that. I also see a lot of debate about he/him lesbians, and you can be a he/him lesbian. Pronouns do not equal gender. Just because you like to use he/him, that does not automatically make you a man. And then another thing that I see a lot in this space is the debate about whether or not trans men who before transitioning identified as a lesbian, whether or not they can still identify as a lesbian. I am not a trans man, so I can't necessarily speak on their specific experience, but I can say this in my experience. So I identify as non-binary, kind of gender fluid, but also not too keen on putting an actual label on that. But I don't identify exclusively as a woman. However, for the first 15 or so years of my life, I did identify as a woman, and specifically as a Black woman. I still identify as Black. That's not going to change. I also know that people who may see me on the street would categorize me as a Black woman. I know I present feminine, and so therefore I do live the intersectional experience of a Black woman. However, this does not make me a Black woman, as I don't identify as a woman. However, I do find that communities of Black women are where I feel most safe and most at home. I feel like in communities like that, that is where I find people who understand my lived experience in a way that nobody else really can. Obviously, non-binary, feminine presenting spaces would be a little bit more accurate, but I have yet to find or engage with a space like that, so that's why I'm just saying from my experience. And so because of this close connection, I identify with Black women, but not necessarily as a Black woman, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to encroach on anyone's space by saying that, but I do find that spaces like those are where I most belong. If you apply that mentality to a trans man who identified as a lesbian pre-transition, I can completely understand how they might feel that sense of community with lesbians. And I'm honestly very curious to know about anybody who may have had this specific experience. I want to talk about it. I see a lot of arguments online as well saying that a trans man identifying as a lesbian not only encroaches on women's space because you're allowing a man to identify in a primarily woman-dominated space, but it can also invalidate a trans man's identity because the definition of lesbian is non-men loving exclusively non-men. And then you're putting somebody who does identify as a man in it. You're kind of taking away his status as a man, I guess. And while I can totally see that, I can't necessarily speak on that firsthand because that's not my lived experience. But from my perspective, I can see the difference between identifying with a community and identifying as a part of it. All right, on to the next. So the G in the acronym stands for gay. The term is colloquially and widely used just to refer to anybody who experiences homosexual or homo-romantic attraction. But in the acronym, I typically see it used to describe men who love exclusively men, or if we use the same definition used for lesbians, it would be non-women loving exclusively non-women. Because again, non-binary people can identify as gay. Then the B in the acronym stands for bi, and this is described as anybody who experiences attraction to more than one gender. Could be men and women, could be non-binary people and women, could be non-binary people and men. Literally any combination of two or more genders, any gender identities. And this is often used as a blanket term for people who experience attraction to people of multiple genders. And then the T in the acronym stands for trans. This one is not based on attraction and it's more on gender identity. It's basically just simply put the opposite of cisgender. It's those who identify with a gender identity different than the one that they were assigned at birth. Now, this is a very, very broad umbrella. There's a ton of gender identities under it. It doesn't necessarily mean if you were like born female and you now identify as a man, or you were born male and you now identify as a woman. There's so much more to it, honestly. Basically, if during your ultrasound appointment before you were born, the tech said it's a boy or it's a girl, and then as of right now you just say no, it doesn't even matter what you say after it, that can qualify as transgender. Anything under that. It doesn't matter exactly how you identify now. Now, there is a little bit of nuance in trans identities in terms like trans masc versus trans man, or trans femme versus a trans woman. So from what I found, if somebody identifies as trans masc, that means that they were born female and have transitioned to a state more aligning with masculinity. They don't necessarily have to identify as a man, but just they identify more with masculinity. Same for trans femmes. They were born male and have since transitioned to a role more aligned with femininity. Whereas a trans man has transitioned to identify with the gender identity of a man, and a trans woman has transitioned to meet the gender identity of a woman. And a trans man could still be feminine, a trans woman could still be masculine. This also introduces the terms of AFAB and AMAB, or AFAB and AMAB, meaning assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. And just as a general rule of thumb, don't ask people if they're AFAB or AMAB, because that's asking what's in their pants, and that's weird. You don't ask people that on the daily. Just don't. Then the Q in the acronym stands for queer. It can also mean questioning, but queer is sort of a blanket label to refer to anybody who's a part of the community, or they're questioning, or they just want to remain unlabeled for whatever reason they choose. Now, these next ones that I'm going to describe are technically part of the acronym, but they're part of the extended acronym, and there's multiple different variations. So I just did the one that's most common, and then now I'm going to explain some more. So we also have intersex. So this is used to describe people who fall outside of the gender binary in terms of either genetic material or sex characteristics. And their existence actually proves that sex is not binary, but it's bimodal. The difference being that sex is not totally black and white, where it's like you're male or you're female and there's no in between, because there is in between. There will basically always be some gray area. Then I just have in my notes A, because I didn't know how to like abbreviate it in a way that would include both aromantic and asexual, so A. And this describes people who feel either little to no romantic or sexual attraction based on the label. There's some pretty common misconceptions that I see about people who are either aromantic or asexual. Basically that they either can't be happy in relationships or can't enjoy time in the bed, but that's not the case. The experience varies very much person to person, but they all just pretty much experience attraction differently. A lot of people who identify as both aromantic and asexual often refer to themselves as aro-ace, so that's where that term comes from. Then we have pan, meaning either pansexual or panromantic. And this is used to refer to people who feel attraction to people of all genders, regardless of their gender. Someone who's pansexual would just see the person for who they are, or, you know, their soul or their personality or something before they even really see their gender, and it's not a major consideration. This is very similar to another orientation called omni, meaning either omnisexual or omniromantic. And this also refers to attraction for people of all genders, but in this case, gender does play a role. I was kind of trying to look into the difference between the two because they do come across as very similar. And it was a little bit difficult for me to wrap my head around the concept of seeing or not seeing gender, but I was able to make an analogy that I think kind of makes sense. So being pan is kind of like enjoying all sports, regardless of what the sport is or what you're doing in it, because you just love the adrenaline rush, right? Whereas being omni is sort of enjoying all sports, but having a slight preference towards indoor sports for whatever personal or intrinsic reason. Then we also have a couple of gender identifications to mention. We have non-binary, which is used to refer to anybody who falls outside of the traditional gender binary of like man and woman. This is where I am. And you might also hear the term genderqueer for this, which is pretty much just being queer, but in terms of gender. Technically, under the non-binary blanket would also be agender, which is used to refer to people who experience no gender. And basically, people who are agender don't adhere or acknowledge traditional gender roles. One that I completely somehow forgot to put in my notes, but meant to write down, was apagender. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Basically, that word comes from combining apathy or apathetic and gender. So basically, it just means you're apathetic about gender. You acknowledge that you might have a gender, you might not, but honestly, it's not a big enough factor for you to really consider it too hard. There was a time when I came across the term and I was thinking about it and I was like, that might be me. But then I realized a little bit later down the road that I didn't care enough to even label myself apagender. Then we have gender fluid, which refers to the shifting of gender identity and or expression. This is typically based on either external circumstances or internal realizations or both. It can happen over a long period of time, a short period of time. It can be between as few as 2 or as many as like all genders. There's really no restrictions on it. It really changes by a case-by-case basis. And then one that was really important for me to mention was Two-Spirit. So surprisingly, Two-Spirit is an identity that I hadn't even heard about until recently. It's present in a lot of North American indigenous tribes, and it's used to refer to people who are of a third or otherwise variant gender expression or identity, aside from the traditional roles of man and woman. I've seen a lot of indigenous creators online saying that the reason why a lot of people have never heard about Two-Spirit is largely due to indigenous erasure. So I really wanted to make sure that I included it. And if I got any details wrong, please correct me. I'm also really curious to know more about the identity from like an indigenous perspective. So please let me know. Then I've also included some identities that are, I find, a little bit less commonly spoken about either online, in person, in queer spaces. So I wanted to highlight them and make sure that they also got their time in the spotlight. So first we have poly, meaning either polysexual or polyromantic. At first when I saw this, I thought that it was referring to polyamory, but it's not. That's a separate thing. This is referring to people who experience attraction to those of multiple but not necessarily all genders. So if you remember before when we talked about like pan and omni, it was referring to people with attraction to those of all genders. This one's multiple but not necessarily all. Spectra, meaning spectrosexual or spectroromantic, is similar. It refers to attraction to those of a broad range of genders without too much concern for categorization or like any hard labeling. Then there's gray, meaning either gray sexual or gray romantic. This is on the arrow A spectrum, so that's why the flags are sort of similar in color. This basically refers to people who experience low levels of attraction that can fluctuate very unpredictably, and obviously it's on a case-by-case basis. Even the fluctuations can vary for a single person, both in intensity and, like how long the fluctuations last. Then we have demi, which refers to either demisexual or demi-romantic. This is, again, on the arrow A spectrum. And this is used to refer to people who very rarely experience attraction upon first meeting somebody. Basically, it's really difficult to experience that love at first sight feeling. They have to develop a bond or some kind of relationship with that person before they can start to feel that attraction. Think like a constant friends to lovers sort of dynamic. Then we have abro, meaning abrosexual or abroromantic. And I described it in my notes as basically gender fluid, but in terms of attraction. Basically, orientation can shift and change over time between different orientations, different intensities. The period of time can change. And again, it's different for every person. Then we have hetero, which basically means either hetero-romantic or heterosexual. This is primarily used to describe attraction to non-binary people, but I also saw that sometimes trans people were included, but not all the time. Sometimes it means people are exclusively attracted to non-binary people, sometimes not exclusively. So it's a very fluid orientation, I think. It used to be referred to as scolio, meaning either scoliosexual or scolioromantic, but because the root of the word like scolio, I mean, you think like scoliosis, it means either bent or twisted. So that got changed because it was deemed offensive. It made it seem like the non-binary people at the center of this attraction were wrong or like broken in some way. So people have been changing it recently. And honestly, thank God for that. Then we have gyna, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, gynosexual or gyneromantic. This is another broad term that's used to refer to those who experience attraction to women or just femininity as a concept. Then on the other side of that, we have andro, which is androsexual or androromantic, which refers to attraction to men or masculinity as a concept. I found these two really interesting, mostly because we know that presentation doesn't equal gender. So just because somebody's feminine, that doesn't make them a woman. And just because somebody's masculine, that doesn't make them a man. So I guess it's kind of leaning heavily on that or attraction to women or femininity, not women and femininity. I don't know. And then on a similar note, we have sapphic, which is used to refer to any woman or woman-aligned person. So think like trans femmes or non-binary people who are more closely associated with womanhood, who regardless of their sexuality or romantic orientation are attracted to other women or woman-aligned people. And then on the other side, we have achelion, which similarly is used to refer to any man or man-aligned person who, regardless of their sexuality or romantic orientation, is attracted to other men or man-aligned people. Now, these can refer to people who are either like completely homosexual or homoromantic, or somebody who's bi or pan or literally anything. And in this way, a lot of people fit under these labels. So you see, pride is so beautiful. I'm telling you all this not to make your head spin, but just to show you how beautiful our world is, how incredible and diverse all of the people in our world are, and to show you how cool all of the flags are because they're so beautiful. I love how they all give off their own separate vibe while also you can see it and be like, that's a pride flag. Like they have that bit of like whimsy. Oh, I wrote in my notes, there's nothing more lovely than love. Oh. So 100% feel free to save this video, use it as a reference. I 100% want it to be a resource, but also I would completely implore you to look for other labels or identities that I didn't mention in here, because there's so many more. And honestly, it makes sense that there are so many more because everybody experiences attraction differently. Of course, there are some broad umbrellas that people can fit under, but ultimately orientation is such a personal and unique journey that it's really difficult to nail into words. I think that it's wonderful that there's so many ways that people identify themselves. I really want my channel to be a safe space for anybody who identifies as queer, any of the labels that I've mentioned or any of the other ones. And I really hope that the rest of this June goes well for us. I really hope people can find their communities and stay safe and love freely, because every day that we fight this fight, we get closer to acceptance and equality. And that is a future worth fighting for. But in all, that's pretty much all that I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. And I don't have an outro, so bye.